Morning in Michigan, police have arrested a man who's suspected of chopping up his wife.
A stranger seized a child.
3 men accused of abducting and holding the women hostage are in jail.
Horror inflicted on other people surrounds us more or less constantly. And Adolphs argues that because of our wiring, we are just not set up to ignore it.
A serial killer.
And so it distorts our experience of the world, activating our fear when we don't need it.
It's only a matter of time before he strikes again.
Essentially, Adolphs is saying that a lot of our modern first world fear is totally unnecessary.
I think not being able to experience fear is mostly lethal if you're in the wild. Not in today's world. I mean, I'm sitting here in my office and, other than a microphone in my face, there's not a particular threat going on. So our environment, which of course isn't the environment in which we evolved, there just aren't that many hazards around.
Which got Lulu and I thinking, what would happen to us if we somehow disappeared our fear? This is Invisibilia.
I'm Lulu Miller.
And I'm Elise Spiegel. And what we do on our show is look at the invisible things, like emotions, assumptions, beliefs, ideas that control human behavior. And today, the thing that we are looking at is fear. Oh my God! That ancient chemical reaction that shaped us and allowed us to survive as a species. How would our lives be different if we were able to short-circuit fear?
All right, Elise, so you're going to get us started, right?
Yeah. So the question is, what happens when you disappear fear? And to answer it, I went to one of the only people who can, objectively try to answer that question, a neuroscientist at the University of Southern California named Antonio Damasio.
I always like to say that I have a perfect face for radio.
Yeah. No, I know. It's the same for me.
See, one day in the early 90s, a young woman came to see Damasio. We're going to call her SM, for reasons that I'll get to shortly.
She looked like a pleasant woman. She had a very open face, looked like a perfectly normal person.
SM had originally come to the hospital because she had these unexplained blackouts. But Damasio says that sitting there, everything about her seemed quite normal, except for one small thing, her physical proximity.
It struck me a little bit out of the ordinary. She was very close to you. And that, of course, came to have an interpretable meaning after we knew more about her. But at that point, I would say that she looked like a perfectly normal person. And she is a perfectly normal person, except for one particular problem.
The problem? The woman couldn't feel fear, literally could not experience that emotion.
Fearless, that's the best way of describing it.
Now, fearlessness like this, that is a biological inability to feel fear, is incredibly rare. Fear is one of the most basic emotions that we have, so it's next to impossible to find someone without it.
Fear, it's a very towering emotion.
In fact, scientists have identified only about 400 people on Earth with the condition that was causing fearlessness in SM.
Very unusual disease called Urbach-Wiete disease.
Urbach-Wiete has three main symptoms. People with the disease usually have an extremely hoarse voice, small bumps around their eyes, but also the disease leads to these deposits in the brain.
Deposits of calcium, little stones in certain parts of the brain, and one part in particular is a favorite for those deposits, and that is the amygdala.
The amygdala are two almond-shaped structures deep in the brain, critical for the processing of fear. And in SM's brain, her amygdala were completely calcified.
It's a little bit as if you would go to this region and literally scoop it out.
Which is why, biologically, SM couldn't feel fear. That bit of brain couldn't signal to the rest of her body that it was time for her heart to start racing and her palms to sweat. It's also why SM was so profoundly valuable to the scientists who studied her, like Damasio and the fear researcher Ralph Adolphs that you heard earlier. Because fear seems critical to survival. But here was SM, alive and also completely normal in other ways. She had normal intelligence and no problem with any other emotion.
Joy, sadness, anger. She was perfectly normal with those. Fear was really an isolated defect.
In a sea of emotions, her brain had subtracted just one.